So welcome everybody to today's webinar. Very excited for today's conversation. I am Robin Garrett, Chief Customer Officer here at AIIR Consulting. And I think this is going to be a really important topic today. We know that being a leader is a really hard job. There's a lot of uncertainty involved, but we're also seeing a lot of change, right? In fact, faster change, increased change, global uncertainty, and a need for more equitable distribution of power. And so we're going to talk today about what does the next evolution of leadership need to look like. And just to get us started, why don't you go ahead, if you have some ideas, what competencies do you think might be important for leaders in 2030 and beyond? Go ahead and let us know in the chat what you think might be important. Good. Resilience, empathy, lots of empathy, great. Agility, flexibility, able to lead change, very good. Collaboration, being strategic, very good. Emotional intelligence, humility, open-mindedness, that's excellent. Excellent. Thank you for sharing. I think we're going to cover a lot of that today. We'll get into lots of areas and why we think they're really important. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Derek Lusk. He is AIIR's Head of Executive Assessment, and he's going to take us through this presentation today.
Thanks so much, Robin. Hi, everyone. As Robin noted, my name is Derek Lusk, and we're going to talk today about the next evolution of leadership. And we're going to take really an evolutionary perspective on leadership and really take you through a journey from past to present to future, with the goal to answer what leadership competencies are essential for today, 2030, and beyond. So before I jump in, let's talk a little bit about just the agenda at a high level, okay? So first, we're gonna define what is leadership. So to get us started, we really want to talk about what is leadership. What is kind of the basic definition of leadership? It's an amorphous term. There's a lot of definitions out there. There's almost as many definitions as people that talk about it, right? We really want to take an evolutionary scientific perspective to the definition of leadership, because that's going to provide us, again, with a nice foundation for the talent management activities that we engage in. Then we'll talk about how has leadership evolved up to today. Again, we're going to take you on an evolutionary-based kind of journey. We're going to look into human origins, and we're going to see how has leadership evolved over time up to the present state, up to the present day. And then we'll look out into the future. So how will leadership need to change in the future? And also, how will it not need to change? Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about what's going to stay the same, and then also what's going to be different as we move into the future. And we want to end with a very practical discussion about what are the actual leadership competencies that are necessary for today and into the future, right? So we're going to, at the beginning, a lot of it is going to be theoretical. It's going to be all of our research on leadership and kind of our evolutionary perspective and how we approach it. So there's going to be a lot of ideas, right? It's going to be a lot of ideas and a lot of theory. But at the end, we want to bring it all together and really talk about what are the actual leadership behaviors, what are those essential leadership characteristics that we need moving forward. So let's go ahead and get started. So what is leadership? Now we have a definition here for you, right? Leadership motivates and mobilizes a group toward a common objective, okay? Now this might seem obvious to you, but we really want to expound on this a little bit, okay? If you think about any of the major human achievements in our civilization, any of the major human achievements, it could be the International Space Station, the Egyptian pyramids, our communities, our schools, our governments, and so down the line. All of this is the result of large-scale cooperation. And leadership is what facilitates that, okay? So leadership at its core is a mechanism for group performance, okay? Leadership should be defined as the ability to build and maintain teams to outperform the competition. Again, it is a mechanism for group performance. Now, just that definition, if we use that definition in organizations, that actually informs a lot of our talent management activities, right? We shouldn't define leadership in terms of supervisor ratings of performance. right? We shouldn't define leadership as an individual objective or goal. This is all about team engagement and team performance, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. So a mechanism for group performance, but how did leadership evolve over time? Again, if we look into the past to kind of inform the future, what does it say? So let's go way, way back, 250,000 years ago, right? So again, leadership is a mechanism for group performance, but that mechanism has sort of shifted and changed over time. 250,000 years ago, we were in egalitarian bands of around 40 people. For most of human civilization, right? We've lived in egalitarian bands of about 40 people from 250,000 years ago to about 10,000 years ago, okay? Now, these bands were fiercely democratic, okay? So the Romans didn't invent democracy, our hunter-gatherer ancestors did, right? So they were fiercely egalitarian. Leadership's role for most of human life was to reinforce an egalitarian ethic. It was to reinforce a democracy. Now, the question is, from an evolutionary perspective, is why was that the case? And the reason that that was the case is they really needed to deal with quick changing, quick moving ecological problems, okay? So think about what it was to live a nomadic life in a 40-person community where you're roaming the lands, right? You're hunting, you're dealing with weather and all of these environmental, ecological challenges. You really needed to be adaptable. You needed to innovate. You needed the flat organizational structure that resembles a modern day like innovation lab, right? And leadership's goal, again, was to reinforce this democracy, okay? And it's really interesting, they had leveling mechanisms, right? So they would actually have mechanisms such as like ridiculing people and so forth to thwart anyone that was a potential upstart that would try to dominate the group, okay? So 250,000 years ago, fiercely egalitarian, helped a lot with innovation and adaptability, agility, and that kind of thing. Now, 10,000 years ago, there was seriously a dramatic shift, right? The advent of agriculture. When humans discovered agriculture, our society completely transformed. We went from nomadic to sedentary, right? Instead of roaming around for food sources were concentrated around the world, right? And in farming communities, essentially. Now, with that, group size increased dramatically. We went from 40 people to 5,000 people to 10,000 people in one community, okay? The only way at that time to coordinate 5,000, 6,000 people was a strict hierarchy, okay? So with the advent of agriculture, interestingly, you have the advent of dictatorships. So what you'll see is nearly all human societies from 10,000 years ago to about 200 years ago, which I'll talk about in a minute, were dictatorships, okay? That's almost the default form of organization, social organization for humans with agriculture, okay? Now, so leadership's role here was much different. Remember, egalitarian bands, what we're doing here is we're reinforcing democracy for innovation. In a dictatorship 10,000 years ago in these chiefdoms and kingdoms, it was all about structure, okay? It was about a command and control leadership style. It was leadership by dominance versus egalitarian. So that went on for quite a while. Interestingly, it wasn't until about 200 years ago that began to change and we started to break down these kind of strict power structures, right? So what was going on in the world 200 years ago? You have the scientific revolution, you have the industrial revolution, all types of revolution, by the way. 200 years ago, you have the American Revolution, you have the French Revolution. And really what was going on here was we started to infuse science into not only organizational life, but into life in general. So you have things like the Enlightenment, major movement in Europe called the Enlightenment, where mathematicians and philosophers and so forth were essentially challenging old dogma, right? Old kind of these power structures that were upheld by certain ideologies. Science and philosophers, again, mathematicians, started to kind of challenge this, right? And this was we mentioned this period in time because it started to open up from dictatorships to sort of present day where we have systems that are a little bit more open. During this time period, the attitudes of workers became a little bit more important, right? business at this point was, in the Industrial Revolution, you can imagine that it was still very hierarchical, slow. It was conducive to long planning horizons versus needing to be adaptable and agile and so forth. But still, this marks a time period where we started to kind of break down those strict hierarchies and start to open up our systems, our businesses and society and so forth. So that leads us up to today, right? And if you think about today, our main point here is that we're trying to synthesize history, okay? Which is extremely challenging, by the way. But what we're trying to do is synthesize our evolutionary past. So today in organizational life, what do you have to do? You actually have to have the flexibility, adaptability, agility, the ability to be malleable, to transform our business models, our value propositions, and so forth on a dime, like our egalitarian ancestors did with democracy. Okay, we have to do that today. The challenge is we have to do it in these huge ecosystems, right, of thousands of people versus a 40-person egalitarian band. So our main point here is that we're going to have to, as a society, be adaptable and flexible in the context of these huge systems, right? And we're going to have to, that's a trade-off, that's a tension between change, innovation, being strategic and looking into the future with maintaining kind of enough structure and stability so things don't spin out of control, okay? So leaders need to be flexible. They need to balance competing states, the equity and innovation of an egalitarian democracy with the control and coordination of a hierarchy. Okay, so we're really getting at this idea of leadership, dynamism, flexibility, being able to do kind of more than one thing, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. So that's a little bit about the past, but how does leadership need to evolve for the future? So the first thing I would say is it's going to be the same but different, right? So, you can imagine that if you think about 10 years, if you think about our whole evolutionary history, 10 years is a relatively short time in terms of human evolution, right? So our cognitive architecture, human psychology, our brain is actually not going to change that much. Our brain right now is actually adapted to 100,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago. In evolutionary psychology, there's this thing called mechanisms, evolutionary psychology mechanisms, right? And these psychological mechanisms take so long to change that today we're actually operating with kind of an old operating system. It's like an old cognitive architecture, right? It's actually the reason that you're afraid of spiders, but you're fine driving around in a car on lack of sleep, right? With lack of sleep. We're operating with this old psychology. That's going to continue to be the case. Because of that, leadership is leadership in a lot of ways. The main dimensions of human performance will remain the same. And we're going to talk about these dimensions in more detail in a little bit, but they're basically relationships and people leadership, their performance and productivity, and it's about strategy, kind of the big picture, and also execution. So these four primary dimensions of human performance are actually going to remain the same over time. If you think about something like integrity under relationships and people leadership, that won't change 10 years from now. And we would actually argue that leadership is going to matter more than ever moving into the future, right? So I love this quote by Peter Drucker: only three things happen naturally in organizations: friction, confusion, and underperformance. Everything else requires leadership. And this really, really speaks to our definition of leadership that we noted before, insofar as it's a mechanism for group performance. It's there to help us cooperate with each other. And moving forward, it's going to be needed more than ever, considering all of the challenges we're facing as a society. Remember how we're going to need to be both innovative, flexible, kind of strategic, but also maintain, right, some stability so it doesn't get out of hand. So leadership will matter more than ever. So identifying effective leaders will continue to be a challenge. Interestingly, we have all the tools that we need today to identify leaders in organizations, okay? In psychology and IO psychology, today, we have all of the quantitative tools at our disposal that we need to forecast, to empirically and quantitatively predict how leaders will do in organizations. So if you think about high potential programs, if you think about leadership identification, we have all of the quantitative methods that we need today. We just need to start using them, okay? In addition, if you think about leadership development, we have all of the quantitative and qualitative sources of data that we need today to build effective leadership development programs, to jumpstart coaching engagements, and so down the line. The interesting thing is we're just not using them that much. We're not using data enough in organizations, right? And a big reason for that, of course, is organizations are political. So a lot of what we do is actually based on human intuition. It's based on politics and so down the line. It's quite rare that we're employing very strong empirical methods and people analytics in all of our talent management activities. So the point here is we don't need some mind-blowing innovations, right? Over the next 5 years, next 3 years, 10 years, you're going to hear a lot about innovation in psychometrics. You're going to hear a lot about innovation in leadership. You're going to hear about digital leadership and all these other things. And I think a lot of that is actually fake news, and it's more marketing than true science. We have the science today to be effective at doing this. So the other thing is that people who seem the most like leaders will still be the least effective, okay? So this is a sociobiological concept, and it's called multi-level selection theory. I'm not going to go into this, but I mentioned that just so if you want to do your own research, you can Google it. Again, it's called multi-level selection theory in sociobiology. There's a guy named E.O. Wilson and David Sloan Wilson have done a ton of work on this. And simply what it says is that in any human group, in organizations, you tend to promote those that are more aggressive, charismatic, assertive, colorful. Those are the individuals that rise to the top. Okay, we call this leadership emergence. So who is in our high potential talent pools? These are the people that are in our high potential talent pools. If we're not using data, if we're using intuition. Again, these individuals are socially aggressive and charismatic, and they're in the talent pool regardless of their true talent for leadership, right? So you have that group. You have the other group of effective leaders that they do less politicking, less managing up, and they're humble, they're empathetic, right? We mentioned empathy. It's going to be a characteristic we need in the future more than ever. You have inclusivity. These individuals are emotionally intelligent, and so down the line. There's an awesome study by a guy named Fred Luthens, and he looked at 457 leaders, executives, and it's really, really well done study. He followed these people around and tracked what they would do on a day-to-day basis, right? What he found is these 457 individuals fell into two groups, okay? One group was the emergent leaders that, again, they politic, they spend a lot of their time managing up, right? They focus a lot on their reputation with superiors. And then the other group was the leaders that were more effective, based on team performance and so down the line. The real interesting point here is that they didn't overlap, right? There was very little overlap. There's literally 10% overlap between the two groups. So if you think of any executive, any leader, chances are that they fall into one of those buckets or the other, right? And what I'm saying is that we really need to use quantitative tools to flesh out those hidden gems, the people that have a true talent for leadership as opposed to just charisma, okay? Now, this is going to be even harder, right? Because overconfidence is kind of a mainstay, right, in the executive ranks and also in our society overall, right? So overconfidence will continue to plague organizations, all right? Now, interestingly, individualism is on the rise as well. So individualism is a dimension of culture. If you think about individualism versus collectivism, individualism is the focus on individuals, right? Individual rights and so forth versus the collective. Ton of benefits to that, okay? But it's on the rise all around the world. And in addition, and similarly, narcissism is on the rise. So if you look at the data on the narcissistic personality inventory, it's pretty wild, right? Personality doesn't change that much from generation to generation. However, if you look at narcissism, it's like through the roof right now. And this is challenging, right? So this will continue to be a problem for us. If you look at the slide here, this is actual data on the Hogan Development Survey, and this is 85,000 leaders. And what it shows is the biggest derailing characteristics, or the most common derailing characteristics, are bold, so overconfidence, mischievous, which is risk-taking. And you could actually think of like the global financial crisis of 2008, right? Overconfidence, risk-taking. Colorful is like social dominance. It's being the center of attention. It's hogging the limelight, pushing others to the periphery versus including them. And then you have imaginative, which is all about overconfidence in your own ideas and the future, okay? So this is empirical data on 85,000 leaders that shows, charismatic leadership tends to be the reason that leaders tend to derail or tend to fail, okay? So given all this, bad leadership will continue to be widespread. Today in the world, 70% of countries are still dictatorships. Interestingly, we've come a long way, but it's still not great. 70% of countries are dictatorships. If we look inside organizations, 75% of people say the worst aspect of their job is their immediate supervisor, who's tyrannical. And as a matter of fact, the majority would take a pay cut to have them fired. Okay, there's economic problems with this, but also major moral consequences, right? The economic problem is that because of this, only 30% of people are engaged in the US, and they're really not dedicating all of their physical, cognitive, and emotional energy to the team, right? That's economic. They're not participating. They're alienated, they're disengaged, they're moving away, they're trying to get out of work, they're shopping on the internet all day. I don't know what they're doing, but they're not engaged in what you're trying to do as a leader, right? The moral perspective is they wake up every day and they go to work and they have a lot of job dissatisfaction, and job dissatisfaction is under life satisfaction. So they're bringing a lot of this home to their spouses. There's stress leads to medical problems. There's a whole host of social problems with bad leadership. And then again, also on the economic side. So this will continue to be the case. And there is an argument that it could get worse because our leadership challenges today and in the future are becoming more challenging, right? It's becoming harder. Imagine everything that we're going through today with the pandemic and so down the line, and we're having to shift our business models. We had to change business models. We had to move entire workforces to remote on a dime. This is very challenging. It's stressful. It's a lot of ambiguity. And with all of that, you have these kind of stress reactions and so forth. And I think bad leadership is not only going to continue to be widespread, but it could get worse as we face all of these kind of monumental challenges. So what needs to change in 2030? So first, we need to identify talent more effectively, okay? The further from our hunter-gatherer ancestors we are, the more difficult it becomes to identify talented individuals, okay? Think about our economy today. We're really in a knowledge economy, and it's going to only speed up quicker and be more of a knowledge economy, right? If you think about the past, you have tasks, if you think about the hunter-gatherer days, it's really easy to evaluate if someone has the ability to do a task versus the knowledge economy is a little bit more intangible, right? So it's going to be more and more difficult to identify what these things look like, good leadership, good talent, and so down the line. It's going to be a little bit harder moving forward. So we really need to kind of start using these quantitative tools more and more as we get further into the knowledge economy. Remember, a lot of the tasks, right, of previous jobs, first, a lot of jobs are going away, right? Second is a lot of the tasks are going to be automated by AI and other technologies. So a lot of what we're going to be doing in the future is social. It's leadership-based. It's having emotional intelligence. It's a lot of the intangibles that are going to be the difference maker in the future. We also need to focus on self-awareness. We need to enhance self-awareness in leadership. The only way to get better is to know what you are and aren't good at. Now, remember, I talked a lot about overconfidence. I talked a lot about individualism, right? And with society going in that direction, self-awareness is becoming harder and harder. And strategic self-awareness is the key to being able to be a dynamic leader, right? Self-awareness, using your prefrontal cortex to really modify and change your behavior and adjust your natural proclivities is going to be the key. It's the key to being able to change your behavior and modify your natural inclinations, okay? We need to provide leaders with real feedback, right? The only way to get self-awareness is to speak truth to power. It's to give straightforward feedback. If you're in a top position right now, you know firsthand that it's difficult to get candid and straightforward feedback, right? And interestingly, our direct reports are the consumers of leadership, and they're the ones that are either afraid or just hesitant to give feedback to our top leaders. If you're a CEO right now, a lot of times it's difficult to know how things are truly going because people are telling you what you want to hear. Now, match that with overconfidence, match that with individualism, match that with focusing on strengths over areas for development. We're really feeding into this overconfidence in the executive ranks, right? We need straightforward feedback to give our leaders an opportunity to adjust as necessary, okay? Why do they need to adjust? Think about multicultural teams. Think about everything going on in the world, globalization, right? And the question is, can you be a dynamic leader? In order to get there, we need that kind of foundation of self-awareness to know where we're at, what we're doing, and so forth. So we need to get better at feedback. We need to focus on the purpose of leadership, okay? Leadership isn't about the success of a single individual. It's about the success of a group. Remember our definition for leadership? If you get one thing out of this, it could just be the definition of leadership because that'll inform a lot of your talent management practices, right? If you think that leadership is about the success of a group, you wouldn't only use supervisory ratings of performance or HR business partner nominations for promotions. What would you use? Well, you would use the team dynamics. How are they impacting their team? What do their direct reports say about their leadership? Again, the direct report is the consumer of leadership. They are the one being led. Everyone else is an outside observer. Okay, so we would get more rigorous about team engagement, team morale, team satisfaction, team productivity of the people that the leader is leading. Okay, so the definition is a great starting point because it's the bedrock, it's the foundation, and it informs all of our talent management activities from there. So we need to focus on the purpose of leadership as we move along into the future. Okay, we talked quite a bit about this idea of leadership flexibility and dynamism. So how can you be a dynamic leader? It's easy to talk about a VUCA business environment when times are good. Now the stakes are even higher. We need leaders that can dexterously shift between opposing but complementary behaviors. Can you go into the innovation team, the brainstorming team, and provide a sense of structure to make sure that we can execute on the ideas? Can you go into that team and provide stability? Can you make sure things are aligned with organizational resources and the ideas aren't getting too alienated from reality or eccentric? Conversely, can you go into the operations meeting and can you bring a lens of creativity and innovation to that versus incremental process improvement? Can you think of radical ways to revolutionize operations? Okay, can you play that role in the meeting? Again, I mentioned multicultural teams. If you think about diversity and inclusion, follower expectations are different, okay? We can't just use our natural inclinations and our leadership style with everyone. We can't only focus on our strengths and over-rotate on those, right? We need to be different things to different people and leverage certain aspects of ourselves depending on the context and depending on the situation. So this is the main idea behind dynamic leadership. It's being well-rounded, being able to do really more than one thing. To do that, we need good quantitative analysis to know where we're at, and we need self-awareness and the ability to kind of adjust and shift over time. So what does dynamic leadership look like? Okay, so again, we talked a lot about the theory, the background of ideas that support, kind of our position on leadership, our leadership philosophy. Here, we want to start getting into what are the actual characteristics, right? We talked about being a dynamic leader and flexible, but it's like flexibility of what, right? If we're going to engage in something like behavioral complexity, what are the buckets? Like, what are the main components that I'm being flexible on? So we want to outline 4, and then we'll talk about kind of the dynamic tension between them. So the first dimension is relationships. And when you think of relationships, I just want you to think about people leadership. So it's about making people feel comfortable to bring their entire authentic selves to work. So leaders who understand relationships, they create 2 main things that we need in organizations to be successful, productive, and so forth. One is psychological safety. And psychological safety really makes people feel comfortable bringing their true self to the party, right? For that reason, it helps us with innovation. It helps us to canvas the full spectrum of ideas and get everyone's input and so forth, right? So psychological safety. Google did a lot of research on psychological safety and how it's the key determinant of team effectiveness. It's really, really important. People leadership facilitates that. On the other hand, you have employee engagement, right? So what is employee engagement? It's when your employees wake up every day with passion and they contribute all of their energies to the cause, as I talked about earlier. Employee engagement has those major economic benefits of being more productive, being more innovative, along with psychological safety, right? Being more satisfied in the job, but also way more productive. Interestingly enough, some people wake up every day and they're engaged, they believe in the mission, and they will work 12 hours a day voluntarily, right? And that's employee engagement. So what does a focus on relationships look like? I think Satya Nadella is the perfect example. Someone mentioned empathy as something we need going into the future, and Satya Nadella is just the archetype for this, right? In 2014, Satya Nadella completely transformed Microsoft. He has a book called Hit Refresh. If you haven't read it, check it out. But he is leading with humility, openness to different perspectives, inclusion, empowerment instead of punishment, and really these authentic interactions, right? Interesting with Satya Nadella, he's obviously in the succession planning process for Microsoft, and there were a couple people left. There were 2 executives left. He was one of them, and the board is like, hey, we're leaning toward you. We think you'd be a great fit for Microsoft moving forward. And his response was like, are you sure? Like, have you really analyze this, like in how I fit with the organization and how my leadership style fits with what we're trying to do and so forth. And that response really speaks to who he is. He had the greater good in mind. He had Microsoft's future in mind, the future of the communities that it impacts in mind and so forth, versus his own pursuit for individual power. He was very pro-social and other-oriented, and that's relationships-oriented leadership. The next one is performance, and performance is about motivating others to achieve clear and ambitious goals. And it's almost the opposite of relationships, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But these leaders, they have a vision, but what they're doing is they're asserting confidence to drive their teams toward a unified goal. So they're leading from the front, they're competitive, they're assertive, and they're kind of charging forward, driving performance. So you could think of setting lofty goals, inspiring people to achieve them, and so down the line. But there's a focus on performance. And what does this look like? I think Larry Ellison is a really, really good example of this. If you haven't watched the YouTube videos of Larry Ellison, go check those out. He's just very, very competitive, hard charging, extremely driven, almost too much, by the way. And this is a potential strength overused, right? If you're lower on what I just mentioned of relationships and people-oriented leadership, but you're as hard-charging as Larry Ellison and hyper-competitive and so down the line, it could actually become a strength overused. But he's kind of a prototype for this. Yeah, I think that it could potentially be a strength overused given that, how competitive he is and so forth. So the next one's strategy. And strategy is about developing and articulating a compelling vision for how the organization must evolve. Okay, so this one is all about visioning. It's about looking into the future. It's about anticipating changes, right? It's about creativity and innovation, right? Think of remember our hunter-gatherer ancestors and how kind of they were organized. They were quite adaptable, risk-taking, strategic. If you think of agility, adaptability, resilience, and things like that, strategy is all about that adaptability, change, having sort of breakthrough innovations and so down the line. So an example of strategy would be Elon Musk. I mean, he's wildly innovative. He's very imaginative, creative. He's always like, what can we do better? What can we do differently? How can we transform society? And he's really seizing new opportunities and thinking multiple steps ahead, right? Now, could this become a strength overused as well? Absolutely, right? If you have all of these ideas and you're operating fluidly and you want to change things, that's great, but can you actually get it done and meet deadlines, right? Can you actually meet the deadlines for Tesla? We have all this innovation, but A, is it practical? Can we meet the deadlines? Is it something that we can execute on, right? And that leads us to execution. We need something to balance out change and strategy, and that would be execution. Execution is about making the most efficient and practical use of the organization's available resources. Okay, so this one is more about structure. Remember, think of 10,000 years ago, how we had to structure society because there are benefits of tradition and so forth. This one is all about maintaining that stability and structure, right? So these executives are really operationalizing the most promising new ideas, right? They're incrementally improving versus the radical innovation. And they're really vetting new ideas to make sure they're in line with organizational resources, current competitive advantages, and so forth. So this one is all about execution in the short term, stability, getting things done, okay? And it's kind of juxtaposed with strategy, which we'll talk about in a minute. So what does this look like? Jill Barat is a really great example of this. So Jill was at Mattel. She was a big part of Barbie, so the whole Barbie line, right? And she took it from like a $200 million business to I think like 1.8 or 1.9 billion. And she really grew up at Mattel, and she was known for two things. One was her aesthetics and her ability to be creative and so down the line. But she was really and more so known for execution. She was very diligent and prudent. It actually landed her the chief operations officer. So her leadership style was more rotated towards execution. She became the COO. In the spirit of strengths overused, though, she was so successful because of her ability to execute. However, when she was promoted to the CEO role, it ended quite quickly, right? It ended fast. And the reason is because she was over-rotating on execution. She would actually still be in the meetings for designing Barbie, and she would be the one, as the CEO, she would be the one that's still like picking out, what Barbie's gonna wear, like this particular Barbie theme. What's she gonna wear? What's the hairstyle look like? What are the accessories and so forth? She was still making all of those very nuanced decisions as the CEO. She wasn't able to pull back her high performance execution and so forth to kind of see the big picture. So here's the overall picture, right? All of the competencies together. And again, these are the dimensions of human performance. We've done a ton of research at AIIR. We've taken a pluralistic perspective in the social sciences, and all that means is we've integrated a lot of different literatures, right? We've reviewed over 200 journal articles. We've looked at, again, sociobiology. We've looked at anthropology, psychology, the management science literature. And there are really these four dimensions of leadership effectiveness. And again, these aren't going to change, okay? Now, remember, it's all about being a dynamic leader and being able to flex depending on the situation. And this really illustrates that, okay? So you have relationships in the upper right-hand corner, the green part here, relationships. is opposite to performance, right? And these things are competing. When we assess leaders, when we assess executives, there's a negative correlation between those things. If you're high on relationships, you tend to be lower on performance. If you're high on performance, you tend to be lower on relationships. The same is true for strategy and execution. If you look in the upper left, you have strategy. Remember, this is the Elon Musk. This is the visioning. This is the being creative, adaptable, and so forth. It's being able to change the organization. Think of change leadership. Think of transformational leadership. But on the other hand, you have execution. You can actually change too much, and you need to have the other side of execution, the Jill Broad, right? That can vet ideas, that's paying attention to all the details. Can we actually do this? How are we going to execute on this? How can we operationalize everything into the business, right? So same here, those that are like strategic leaders, the Elon Musks of the world, tend to be lower on execution, and vice versa. Those higher on execution tend to be lower on strategy. And we love using this model because we can pinpoint those, right? If we had assessed Jill Broad, we would have said, like, great executor, but the major watch out here is strategy, is strategic thinking. And vice versa, right? Assessing Elon Musk, likely high on strategy and lower on the execution component, right? And we need both of these things, with the main point being, let's see where we're at now. What are our natural inclinations? What's our mindset and leadership style? And moving forward, how can we develop the other side to be more well-rounded, flexible, and so down the line? Now, I want to make sure that we talk a little bit about measuring leadership, right? We are in a moment that demands a new type of leader, but most organizations still select leaders based on the criteria of the past, criteria plagued by bias and internal politics, okay? What we need to do moving forward is infuse science even more into our talent management processes, right? Whether it's leadership identification or it's more on the development side, we need a data-driven approach to selection and development that weeds through the charisma, the overconfidence, really the number one reason leaders fail. We need to weed through that, and we need to identify those in the organization that are really good at leading people and not quite as good at self-promoting themselves, right? To do that, we need to pay special attention to the direct report view. What do the followers think of leadership, okay? What do the followers think of their leader? Are they engaged? Are they productive, right? Versus looking at the individual potential of the leader in terms of how much they tend to stand out, how much they volunteer for things, and so forth. We need to set that to the side, and we need to focus again on team performance versus the individual. So we call our framework and our leadership philosophy AIR dynamics, okay? And we really want to show this because this shows some of the nuances, right? We're talking about these 4 buckets of human performance that we need to flex between, but we just wanted to show that in our quantitative analyses and our qualitative assessment as well, we get to these nuances, right? So you can see under relationships, you have developing people, right? You have kind of building and maintaining high-performing teams. How do you develop, focus on direct reports, career development, things like that? We have diversity and inclusion. You know, we have the DEI. We have humility under relationships that we're really looking at. And remember, it's juxtaposed with performance on the other side, and we take it down another level, right? So you have humility as opposite of confidence in the model, right? So if you look at humility under relationships, on the other side is confidence, right? And we really want to look at these nuances and say, hey, you know, what are the dimensions here that the individual is, you know, versatile on, versus where are they really lopsided? And then we can prioritize and start to pinpoint areas for development in a better way. Now we use, again, all types of qualitative and quantitative data. If you think of the actual methods that we use to assess against our leadership framework, all different kinds of things, right? We use the 360. We actually build algorithms in people analytics, so we're building personality-based algorithms and so forth. We always supplement that with various forms of qualitative data. But again, this is kind of our framework. This is what we're looking at, you know, in terms of what are we actually assessing against. Okay, so thank you so much again for joining. I hope you got a lot out of the talk, and I'm looking forward to answering a few questions.
Thank you so much, Derek. Yeah, so we will try to get to as many questions as we can. We've got about 14 minutes, which is great. A couple of questions have come in already. Please feel free to share your questions either in the chat or to use the Q&A feature. And one question that came in from Catherine is it really possible for one person to excel in all of these different areas?
Well, I think it's a great question, first of all, and I should have mentioned this before, so thanks so much for bringing it up. So first of all, this is kind of the ideal, and it's more a matter of degree, right? So I think that it's going to be very rare. It's going to be very, very rare for someone to score high in all of these dimensions because, again, they're negatively correlated. Is it theoretically possible? Yes. Is it likely to happen? Absolutely not. So our goal is actually to just identify someone's natural proclivities and be able to give them good insights moving forward. So, the idea here is no one's perfect. So, this is an ideal versus something that's going to happen a lot.
Thank you.
No problem.
Excellent. We have a question here from Charles, which is, do you think that the biggest change might be that leadership will not be concentrated in a few people, but that everyone will be expected to step up and lead wherever they are in the organizational hierarchy?
Yeah, I think that democracy will continue to be important due to our need to be agile and flexible, right? Flat structures where you actually leverage everyone's expertise tend to be easier, in terms of adaptability and change and so forth. Whereas if you have a very traditional organization, they tend to be more stable. They tend to be more rooted in habits and so down the line. I will say, and I won't go too far into this, you can Google this as well, but it's called the iron law of oligarchy. And our human institutions, our businesses, they actually trend away from democracy and the concentration of power into a few people at the top. And I think we really need to fight against this because I think it's old psychology. I think it's going to pull us back into dictatorships and so forth, which is not where we need to be moving forward. So ultimately, I think in most well-functioning teams, there is one leader. There's actually really good research on this with NASA teams, and the most high-performing teams tend to have one leader that is kind of the center node of the social network, if you will.
Excellent. We have another question here that asks about how can leaders develop the part of the pie chart that they might not be as strong in to become that fully dynamic leader?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the first, and this is sort of an obvious point, but I'll say it anyway. The first step is to knowing where in the pie chart you are, which is quite difficult. And it's also to know that there are competing dimensions here. Like, those that are high on confidence actually tend to overdo that, right? There's a lot of really well done studies on this idea of strengths overused, meaning where, what you tend to be good at are the same exact things that typically will cause failure or ineffectiveness. So first they need to know, like, hey, where am I on the model, right? From there, I think development needs to be highly tailored as much as possible, right? After we do an assessment, it depends on where they fall in the specific dimensions. I think of development in terms of a few different things. One is coaching. There's a lot of different learning and development methods, right? One is coaching. You have large scale kind of cohort-based leadership development programs. And I think the key here is just really being able to understand where you're at and then outlining just very specific things you need to do. A couple of tips on development that I always give, though, is one, be very focused. Like when you're identifying areas for development, that means you're trying to change a habit. And when you're trying to change a habit, you're really using a lot of your brain power. Because of that, it's cognitively exhausting. So you don't want to try to change 5 things. Like if we were to do an assessment, you're kind of lopsided on multiple things. You want to stay focused. Second thing is be patient. Make sure you're patient. For some reason, when it comes to behavior and kind of the mental side of life, we think we can just change it. Like you actually think you can change your behavior tomorrow. And I would say it's going to be pretty hard to do that. It more so resembles kind of the physical side, where it's more like we need to work out, right? We need to keep at this for 3 months, 6 months, and so forth. So there's just a couple of development tips that I would throw out there.
Excellent, thank you. Another question here is about teams. What about leadership teams? Do they replace individual leaders, and how might that fit into this description here?
Yeah, I think when the beauty of this model is actually that it kind of functions as dimensions of human performance, so leadership effectiveness and leadership performance. But to your exact point, we also need to be thinking about these dimensions in terms of teams. And we do a lot of work with teams at AIIR, and we focus on kind of the culture side, the people side, and the productivity side. And we do that because these are sort of like universal dimensions of human performance and culture. So I mentioned that we really took a pluralistic perspective in creating this model. And what that means is we look at different scientific disciplines. We didn't just myopically focus on psychology. When you look at the culture literature on this, dimensions of culture, organizational culture, typically fall into these same 4 dimensions, because these are actually the dimensions of human performance, and culture is created by leadership. So for that reason, if you're thinking about teams, again, we do a lot of work on teams, but you can actually think of these same buckets, right? And you can start to form teams in that way, right? If you have a leader that's super strategic and visionary, if you have a Steve Jobs, like, how's the team going to balance out that, right? You might need Wozniak, for instance, to focus on the technical and execution side of things.
Absolutely. There's a great question here about stakeholders. So the question is, we talked about how the individual is viewed by their team, the team that reports to them, but a lot of times leaders are judged by either their peer team or those above them. And the question here is about, you talked about traditional perceptions of leaders. How might an individual who's trying to focus on some other areas that are maybe less traditional, help others understand this more well-rounded mindset?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, first of all, it's pretty difficult because in organizations, you have a certain culture, right? You have a collective leadership DNA. Like, if we were to assess 300 leaders, 400 leaders in your organization, there would likely be a certain profile that popped. There would be a certain leadership DNA that everyone is kind of going toward, right? We've done this in the past, and, you'll have an entire organization where the majority of people are high on something like driving performance, but low on people leadership. And it's going to be really, really difficult because this is an entire change management initiative, right? It's not like we can, in terms of organizational effectiveness, we can certainly coach and improve the effectiveness of a single leader via coaching and so forth. But to your point, if you think about the system as a whole, organizations tend to be more homogenous. They tend to be even more homogenous over time. So if you don't use quantitative statistics in your selection process, 5 years from now, you're going to be even more of the same. Like, organizations become more like themselves over time, right?
Absolutely. Question here is, what role does AI play in evaluating leaders this way?
Yeah, AI, well, first, I mentioned the automating our job. So, the people side, leadership and stuff is going to be more and more important. So I would make that point. I think the thing with AI is that there's a lot of awesome, like 5G, there's a lot of technologies coming out that are going to change the game to some degree. But I lean toward not being distracted by fads. And we have, as I noted, we have the tools now to do this effectively, right? So are there innovations in psychometrics and leadership identification? Yes. Are there new and cool ways that we can derive leadership style and personality via language and data scraping and all of these different things? Yes. But I tend to move away from that because we have other selection methods and assessment systems that are old, but they work and no one's using them. So we don't have to wait for some major innovation to be doing this well now.
Very interesting. And then we've got a question here that is about sort of our current moment, right? So we're seeing a lot of change in the world. We're in an interesting moment in time, right? So the question is, which competencies, and I think this person's talking about the subscales, do you think might be important to focus on now to sort of help build a better world or help leaders through these types of circumstances?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give a general answer, but it's very specific to the organization. As I noted, organizations have a culture, they have a leadership style. So when you go into the organization, you would start to get more specific on which, competencies, which leadership behaviors need to be upskilled, and that'll inform L&D efforts and so down the line. So we need to get more specific, and we need to look at the context. We also have hugely global organizations, right? So if we're doing work elsewhere, the culture could be completely different and so down the line. But I will say, just as sort of an anecdotal point, a lot of the organizations that we assess tend to naturally be higher on performance and execution and fast-paced, quick-moving, getting things done in the short term. They're stretched based on time. They're working a lot of hours. They tend to pay a little bit more attention to the performance and execution side of the equation versus strategy and people leadership. So I think, and we're sort of doing this as a society, and I think there's an evolutionary reason for this, by the way, but we're doing this as a society already, and we're focusing on inclusion. We're focusing on, hopefully focusing on humility, given the statistics on overconfidence, narcissism. I think humility is extremely, extremely important because it facilitates self-awareness and so forth. So I would say inclusion and humility are two competencies that come to mind.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, excellent. Well, Derek, are there any, we went through a lot of information today. Are there any, sort of final thoughts you want to share, or any points that you think are most important for people to take away from our discussion today?
No, I would just say when it comes to leadership of the future, if you remember let's say two things. One is that we need to define leadership in terms of team performance. And this is almost unilaterally not done in organizations. I say those words and you're like, yeah, of course, but we don't act on that. Okay. So use that as kind of your guiding light. And then the second thing is the idea of being a dynamic leader versus that there are these competencies and they're linear. What we need to focus on is strengths overused, the idea of kind of flexibility. I don't know about the word balance, but you need to be able to do multiple things. Right. So I focus on dynamic leadership and then that definition that we shared. Dynamic leadership.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Derek. And thank you to everybody who's joined us today. We hope you found this to be a useful discussion and will help you think a little bit differently about what we might be doing with leaders right now to help build the leaders that we need for the future. And thank you all so much for joining.